The majority of chapter 18 of Ezekiel in our series that we've been covering dealt with the superiority of God's administration of judgment over man's. Chapter 19 that we covered last time contained a lamentation involving the final kings of Judah and the house of David. Today then we're ready to continue on in chapter 20. Here in verse 1, the New International has, "In the 7th year, in the 5th month, on the 10th day." Now, a new segment of Ezekiel's prophecy begins at this juncture. Almost a year had passed since the last dated section began in chapter 8. You can go back and see the first few verses of chapter 8 when that series of prophecies came. Now, this date that's given here was the 10th of Av, the 10th day of Av, the 10th day of the 5th month. That would have been in 591 BC when this occurred toward the end of summer, sometime in probably mid to late August of 591 BC. Now, it just so happens that this date, the 10th day of the 5th month, the 10th of Av, would be the same date that Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, would fall to the Babylonians 5 years later in 586 BC. Exactly 5 years after this series of prophecies were given would be the time of the fall of Jerusalem. So it's still 5 years before the culmination of many of the prophecies that have come earlier in this particular book. Now, going on in verse 1, the New International says that on this day, some of the elders of Israel came to inquire of the Lord, and they sat down in front of me. Now, this phrase, to inquire of the Lord, is an idiom, and it means to request an interpretation of an event. They were there to have an interpretation. They wanted God to give them some type of way to better understand, possibly, what had already been prophesied. Now, since the elders had once again come to Ezekiel, they'd come earlier after the first great vision that he had in the early chapters of this book. It appears, since they came, that they still felt the prophesied doom, which would be 5 years from this date, the prophesied doom of the kingdom of Judah and Jerusalem could be averted. They thought maybe, possibly, maybe God could interpret and let us know whether it's possible for this to occur. Now, their wishful thinking, why they may have made this inquiry, may have been due in part to the news of Egypt's recent success in a war that they had waged with Sudan. After his peaceful visit to Phoenicia following the Sudan campaign, there were rumors that Pharaoh Psamtik II, who was the Pharaoh at that time, that there were rumors that he was planning a conquest. He was planning to attempt to come up into the eastern Mediterranean and try to drive out the Babylonians who had encroached into that area. However, after he had made his visit to Phoenicia, he went back to Egypt and became very ill and died less than 2 years later in 589, and therefore was never able to launch his conquest, his attempt to drive the Babylonians back to the Euphrates. So that may have been, because of the time element here, why these elders may have come. Now, going on in verse 2, the Tanakh renders, "And the word of the Lord came to me, O mortal, speak to the elders of Israel, and say to them, Thus said the Lord God, Have you come to inquire of me? As I live, I will not respond to your inquiry, declares the Lord God." Now, as he did earlier in chapter 14 and verse 3, God establishes that he will not answer the questions that they had. Whatever it is they wanted to know, he would not answer their questions. As he says, "Have you come to inquire of me? I will not respond." Verse 4, the Revised English Bible has, "Bring a charge against them, O man," that is Ezekiel, Ezekiel, I'm telling you what to do here. You bring a charge against them. Tell them of the abominations of their forefathers. God warns Ezekiel at this point not to feel overly sympathetic or to make any attempt to defend these elders who were there to ask questions. Rather, Ezekiel was to reiterate the reasons why the prophesied judgment of God against the southern kingdom of Judah and against Jerusalem and against the temple could not be averted. There was no way to turn it back. So he says, tell them about their forefathers. This is already set in stone. There's nothing that can be done to avert the prophesied judgment. Verse 5 goes on in the New King James, say to them, thus says the Lord God, on the day when I chose Israel. Now, the phrase on the day does not necessarily literally mean a particular day. It simply means a time, at the time. At a time in the distant past, God chose Israel. The Hebrew root that's translated chose here, when I chose Israel, the Hebrew root is used only here. This is the only place in all of the book of Ezekiel where we find this Hebrew word. And it emphasizes a very special or very unique selection. It's not something that happens frequently at all. In fact, it's only happened once with a physical nation such as this. God had promised Abraham, the patriarch Abraham, that his descendants who would be inheriting the promised land in the future, because he said they're going to be sojourning. They're going to go outside this land, Abraham. And he told Abraham, they're going to inherit this land 400 years after you're dead. So they're going to be 4 centuries that go by, and during that time, they're going to be enslaved in a nation. And that enslavement would end 400 years after the death of Abraham. That's back in Genesis chapter 15. Therefore, since Israel had already been selected or chosen by God by virtue of being connected to Abraham himself, then that was centuries earlier, this term, when I chose Israel, must refer either to the time he began to deal directly with the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob there in Egypt, when he was going to make them his nation, or it referred to their being told how special their relationship with God would be. Because, again, the decision had already been made 400 years earlier when he chose Israel. He chose them long before they came into existence, long before their father Jacob came into existence. In Exodus chapter 4, let's go back and note what he's referring to here. Exodus chapter 4, and beginning in verse 21. And the Lord said to Moses, when you go back to Egypt, remember he was in Midian, when you go back to Egypt, see that you do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. Now, earlier in this chapter, first part of this chapter, remember God told Moses, well, how are they going to believe me? Well, Moses, I'm going to give you some miracles you can work. You're going to be able to cast your rod down. The rod will turn into a snake. You pick it up by its tail, it's going to turn back into a rod. Take your hand, stick it in your underneath your clothes, bring it out. It's going to be leprous. Put it back in, bring it out, it's going to be healthy again. And, and if they won't believe those first 2 miracles, then, draw some water out of the Nile, pour it out, and when it hits the ground, it'll turn into blood. It won't be water any longer. Those are the things, and this is what he's talking about here. You go and do all those wonders before Pharaoh, which I have put in your hand. Now, going on in verse 22, then you shall say to Pharaoh, thus says the Lord, Israel is my son, my firstborn. Note the special relationship that God has with Israel. They're my firstborn. Let's skip down to verse 29. Then Moses and Aaron went, this is after they'd gone to Pharaoh, they went and gathered together all the elders of the children of Israel, and Aaron spoke all the words which the Lord had spoken to Moses. Then he did the signs in the sight of the people, that is, the rod turning into a snake, the leprous hand, and the water of the Nile River turning to blood in the sight of the people. So the people believed. And when they heard that the Lord had visited the children of Israel, notice how special this is. God had come and visited the children of Israel, that he had looked on their affliction. Then they bowed their heads and worshiped. So this was the time that God chose them, that they knew that they were a chosen nation. When this occurred, when Moses came, Aaron, and they did the wonders, and this was the point that's being made in Ezekiel. Now hold your place in Exodus. Let's go back and see here Ezekiel chapter 20 and verse 4. Again, thus says the Lord, on the day when I chose Israel. Now God stresses it, that Israel did not choose him. This was not initiated on their part. Rather, he did the choosing. He's the one that made the selection. He chose them. Due to the honor, the very honor of being the solitary people on earth selected by God to receive his special favor, Israel should show great respect toward God because we're unique. We're his firstborn. This has never been offered to anybody else. That's the way they should have reacted. Going on in verse 5, and lifted my hand in an oath. I chose them, and I lifted my hand in an oath to the descendants of the house of Jacob, and made myself known to them in the land of Egypt. I lifted my hand in an oath to them, saying, I am the Lord your God. On that day I lifted my hand in an oath to them to bring them out of the land of Egypt, into a land that I had searched out for them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory, or the most beautiful, the complete Jewish Bible has, the most beautiful of all lands. Now, God says he made an oath. Well, God transmitted that oath, because remember the children of Israel, it had to go through Moses. Moses was the lawgiver to Israel. And the oath of God was transmitted to Israel through Moses. Let's go back to Exodus and go to chapter 6, verse 5. And here God speaking to Moses, he tells Moses this, and Moses then is supposed to tell it to the children of Israel. And I have also heard the groaning of the children of Israel. Exodus 6, verse 5. Whom the Egyptians keep in bondage. And I have remembered my covenant. That is, the covenant that he had made with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. I've remembered that covenant. Therefore, say to the children of Israel, I am the Lord. I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. I will rescue you from their bondage, and I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. I will take you as my people, and I will be your God, just like he said back in Ezekiel 20. Then you shall know that I am the Lord your God who brings you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians. And I will bring you into the land which I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And I will give it to you as a heritage. I am the Lord. So here's the oath that God swore to Israel. And Moses transmitted that oath. verse 7 of Ezekiel chapter 20. Ezekiel 20, verse 7, the New Revised Standard has, "And I said to them, cast away the detestable things," or abominations, as the New King James has it. "Cast away the detestable things your eyes feast on," or that you're drawn to, Tanakh has. "Every one of you, and do not defile yourselves with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God." Now, the details of this event are not directly mentioned in the Torah. Not back in Exodus or Deuteronomy. It's not mentioned. Now, it's possible that this instruction here that is recorded in verse 7 was included with God's revelation of Himself to Israel that we just read back in chapter 6, verses 5 through 8. Maybe that is included. It just simply was not recorded. Because remember, we don't have every word of every transmission. It just isn't there. We have just enough information. Now, God is filling in some details in Ezekiel chapter 20 that we don't find in Exodus. He goes further than what the record is in the book of Exodus. And He is telling us exactly the way it was. And we get a little different picture if we go to Ezekiel 20 than if we just stay at Exodus. Because God is giving us how Israel appeared to Him and how they impressed Him. Now, He specified here in verse 7 of chapter 20, He specified that, according to what He says here to Israel, that He alone was their God, not the objects made by the hands of men, which they had been worshiping along with the Egyptians. "I am the Lord your God." Don't defile yourself with these idols, because I am your God. You're one and only. There aren't others. I'm it. I'm not sharing anything with the idols of Egypt. I am the Lord your God, not Ra, none of the other things that you see there in Egypt. All right, going on in verse 8. "But despite God telling them this, despite entering into the oath that He mentioned in the previous verse, but they rebelled against me and would not obey me. They did not all cast away the abominations which were before their eyes, nor did they forsake the idols of Egypt. Then I said, I will pour out my fury on them and fulfill my anger against them in the midst of the land of Egypt." After Moses delivered God's demand to Pharaoh to let Israel leave in the early part of chapter 6, the king of Egypt then required the Israelites, "You go out, gather your own straw for making the brick that you are to make." When he did that, it intensified their workload, so they had to work longer hours every day. The reaction of the Israelites was to ignore God's claim of being their God. Note that here again in Exodus chapter 6. Now, we just read verses 5 through 8 a few minutes ago. I've heard the moaning of Israel. God told Moses, "You tell Israel this, you let them know, I'm swearing this oath that I'm going to do these things." Notice verse 9 then. "So Moses spoke thus to the children of Israel." He then relayed exactly verses 5 through 8 here. God is swearing He's going to do these things. So Moses spoke that. He told Israel that, but they would not heed Moses because of anguish of spirit and cruel bondage. And if they wouldn't heed Moses, it means what? They wouldn't heed God, because Moses was simply relaying what God had said to tell them. They were rebelling against God. So back here in Ezekiel chapter 20, when it says, "They rebelled against me," verse 8, "would not obey me," that's what he's talking about. They continued to worship the idols of Egypt. the idols they had always worshiped. In fact, back in Joshua, we're told in Joshua chapter 24 and verse 14. Joshua was cautioning Israel before he died, don't do these certain things. And he says here, verse 14, Joshua 24, now therefore fear the Lord, serve Him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served, note, latter part of the verse, in Egypt. They served them in Egypt. Serve the Lord. You don't serve those idols. You don't serve those gods. You serve the Lord. Joshua tells them that. Now, there is no record in Exodus of God stating that He would pour out, as it says here, pour out my fury on them. You don't see that. It doesn't say it. It doesn't come right out and say, I'm going to pour my fury out on them for their idolatry. Not while they were in Egypt. It doesn't jump out at you anywhere. Yet it is recorded in Exodus that they did receive some of God's wrath. Like the Egyptians, the Israelites suffered through the first 3 plagues. The water turned to blood, the frogs, and the lice. Now, was it just happenstance that they suffered those? No. They were having the wrath of God, because all of the plagues make up the wrath of God. They were suffering those plagues because of the attitude that God says they had here in Ezekiel chapter 20. They would not heed. They would not. They continued to do whatever they had done before. They did not believe that I was the all-powerful God. And so I'm going to show them that indeed I am. Going on in chapter 20, verse 9, the complete Jewish Bible has, but concern for my own reputation kept me from letting it be profaned in the sight of the nations among whom they were living, in the sight of whom I had made myself known to them, in order to bring them out of the land of Egypt. Prior to the onset of the 4th plague, God instructed Moses, let's go back to Exodus chapter 8 and note this. God instructed Moses to tell Pharaoh that the Israelites would no longer be recipients of the wrath that he was yet to pour out on Egypt. And here in Exodus chapter 8, verse 22, Moses again is telling Pharaoh this, and in that day I will set apart the land of Goshen, in which my people dwell. Now, skipping on down here to verse, just the latter part here, in order, to the end, in order that you may know that I am the Lord in the midst of the land. I will make a difference between my people and your people. Tomorrow this sign shall be. God set the Israelites apart. What he says here. God sets Israel apart to protect them from His wrath, basically for 2 reasons. The first, as a sign to the Egyptians, and secondly, in order to preserve them as He had promised Abraham back in Genesis chapter 15. Those are the 2 reasons He did what He did. So that the declarations He had made to Abraham and to the Pharaoh of Egypt were fulfilled, proving His supremacy, the supremacy of His name, because He talks here about His name, His own reputation, the supremacy of His name over all things. That means that His decision to separate Israel from the rest of Egypt was not because their conduct warranted Him doing so. They deserved to be punished with the rest of the plagues, but He set them apart, again, for His own reputation. We go back to chapter 20, verse 10. Therefore, I made them go out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. Now note this. Therefore, I made them. Please let that made them go out sink in. Even though there is no direct mention of their deliverance through the Red Sea, it is certainly implied in this verse. That's what he's talking about. If God had left the decision up to the Israelites, they would never have ever left Egypt. Never would have. Now, remember, after the plague of death on the firstborn of Egypt, it was the Egyptians that were urgent to get Israel moving. And so they forced them, get out of here. And then they went and they followed Moses. And then God, in Exodus chapter 14, remember, God placed Israel in a position which would leave them in the need to look to Him for life. They were going to be forced to look to God for life because He intentionally trapped them on the west bank of the Red Sea. And they were hemmed in by the wilderness. They were hemmed in. You look at the map basically where the crossing had to have occurred. And there were mountains that went they go into the Red Sea. And there's this huge sandy bank on the west side of the Red Sea there. And there was the one channel that could lead you through the mountains to that bank. You come out on that bank, you can't scale the mountains. The only way is to go back the way you came or get a boat and cross the Red Sea. That was basically where they were. God trapped them there. On that particular day, the army of Egypt then came through the mountains, the path that they had come, and boxed them in from the west at their rear. And the Israelites, you read in chapter 14 of Exodus, verse 9, they were terrified. In fact, let's go back to Exodus chapter 14 and verse 11. They believed they were going to be slaughtered by the army of Egypt. Exodus 14, verse 11. Then they said to Moses, note this, note the attitude. Because there were no graves in Egypt, have you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Note, that does not sound like they were really that anxious to leave, does it? You have brought us here. Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt? Notice what they're saying. Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. They really said that. That was the reason God was so furious with them. And He poured 3 plagues out on them. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. The only thing that prevented the army from reaching Israel on the west bank of the Red Sea was the pillar of fire that God placed there between them and the Egyptians. The only place they had to go was between the walls of water of the Red Sea. Once God separated the waters and dried out the seabed so that they could walk across. And when they walked across, where did they go? Into the wilderness of Midian. They were in Egypt on the west bank, but when they came up on the east side, they were in the wilderness of Midian. All that area was Midian. And that's what he says back here in chapter 20, verse 10. Therefore I made them go out of the land of Egypt and brought them into the wilderness. They had no other option. They had to go out of Egypt because they couldn't turn around with the Egyptian army behind them. God made them go out. Cecil B. DeMille did not really depict accurately the attitudes. They were a lot more like Edward G. Robinson, I think. Remember him? He was Dathan. He was evil. And that was probably the majority of the Israelites were more like him than, what's his name? Derek. John Derek, who played Joshua. He was just... I really believe that because of everything that transpired. Egypt was firmly locked into the minds of these people. They wanted to stay in Egypt. Back in chapter 20, verse 11, the Tanakh translates, I gave them my laws and taught them my rules, or my judgments, the New King James has, by the pursuit of which a man shall live. Now, this event occurred, of course, at Mount Sinai, when God established the covenant with Israel. This covenant followed the same pattern as treaties formed between kings during that particular period of history. A more powerful king would propose protection and benefits to a lesser king if in turn that lesser king would promise to follow the instructions and be a vassal of the more powerful king. Then the more powerful king would not take his armies and invade the territory, would not, as long as you do what, and you pay the tribute necessary, then that's fine. So if the treaty was agreeable, the greater king would make it binding by putting his seal on the document where the covenant was laid out. All would then know the relationship that existed between the two parties of the covenant. Just like Nebuchadnezzar made a covenant with Zedekiah. Zedekiah promised to be a faithful vassal king. And as we've seen in our study of Ezekiel, he was not faithful. And that, of course, led to the defeat of and overthrow of the southern kingdom. God expected, once, as he says here in verse 11, once he gave them the laws as judgments and so on, the pursuit of which would give, by which a man shall live. He expected the Israelites, once they were given that, to begin living their lives based on the terms of the covenant to which they had agreed. Remember, in Exodus chapter 23, Moses came down and said, oh, this is what God says. All that God says we will do. Then Moses wrote it down, read it to them. All that God says we will do. So they did promise to do it, but they didn't. Important lessons, again, this latter part here, by the pursuit of which, if you just do those things, a man shall live. So important lessons would be learned through their obedience to God's instructions, which in turn would both prolong and enhance their physical lives. Even under the new covenant, obedience to this same basic foundational law is required for eternal life. Remember, God gave the 10 Commandments first, and then there were the judgments and everything and statutes associated with the 10 Commandments. The whole covenant was built on the 10 Commandments. The new covenant is built on the 10 Commandments. When we come to the close of Revelation 22, verse 13, 14, in that area. Blessed are those who do or practice His commandments, that they may have the right to the tree of life. So even with the new covenant, it's still based on that same law. And indeed, if we keep the new covenant, we shall live forever once God enters into that covenant with us. Chapter 20, verse 12. Moreover, I also gave them my Sabbaths to be a sign between them and me, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies them. Note why He expected them to keep that Sabbath, that they might know that I am the Lord who sanctifies, sets apart them. Now, the plural Sabbaths indicates, of course, every Sabbath that falls on the seventh day throughout the year. That is the only day the Sabbath can fall. It cannot fall on a Sunday. Cannot fall on the first day of the week or any other day of the week. It's the seventh day. It always falls at the end of the week. But Sabbaths can also refer to other days that God has sanctified or set apart through the year, which we know to be the annual holy days. Those two are Sabbaths. Just as the weekly Sabbath and the annual holy days were set apart by God from the rest of the week and year, so Israel was set apart from the rest of the nations of the world. God gave them the Sabbath as a sign. Recall, the Sabbath is different than every other day. You, my nation, are different. You're supposed to be different than every other nation. You've got to be different. You've got to do it my way. Not your way, my way. You said yes in the covenant, you've got to do it my way. Not only was the Sabbath a sign then to remind Israel, as all of mankind, that God is the Creator. You go back to Genesis chapter 2, first 3 verses. Sabbath was given, it was made for man, not just Israel. But God's let man go his own way, to the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, but God has called Israel, okay, I'm attaching you to the tree of life. I'm giving you the ability to know what the kingdom of God is all about. I'm not giving it to all of them, but I'm giving you that knowledge. Now, He wasn't offering them the kingdom of God at that time, only select ones. But He did relay the fact that He was Creator. There in Exodus chapter 20, when He talked about the Sabbath. You know, it took 6 days, then the seventh day God rested. He set it apart by His presence. So it's to remind, one reason was to remind Israel that God is Creator, but it also, the Sabbath, the seventh day of the week, served as a reminder that out of all of the peoples, all of the nations on the face of the earth, God had chosen them to be His unique, special people, just like He chose the Sabbath to be unique and special. It was to remind them. Every week they would be reminded, well, this is Sabbath, but you know what? We've got a special relationship with God. And so that day stuck to them. Today, what do people say? Oh, you keep the Jewish Sabbath. Okay, all right, it's God's Sabbath, but it is important that they say Jewish because it means those people have continued, maybe not faithfully to keep it, some of them keep it fairly faithfully, but there's an identification there. There is a sign there. Going on in verse 13, Tanakh has, but the house of Israel rebelled against me in the wilderness. They did not follow my laws, and they rejected my rules, by the pursuit of which a man shall live. Just as He said 2 verses earlier. Now this refers to the rebellion that occurred during the absence of Moses when he went up to Mount Sinai to meet with God for 40 days, 40 nights, when he received the stone tablets from God that God had engraved with the 10 Commandments. All of that's covered back in Exodus chapter 24 when he went up and spent the 40 days and 40 nights. Now, it was while Moses was gone, and of course Joshua was gone with him. That was when basically Aaron was kind of in charge. And so while they're gone, there was Aaron. And Aaron fashioned a golden idol of a calf, of the Apis bull, worshipped in Egypt, before which Israel conducted an orgy. This incredible orgy going on with all kinds of music and whatever else going on. They were banging the drums or whatever they were doing because Joshua says, well, I think there's war in the camp. Moses says, no, that's not war. It sounds like they're having a party down there. Okay, that's what occurred. Okay, so they rebelled against me. They didn't follow my laws. Now this is 40 days. 40 days after they said everything that God has said that we will do. And now what are they doing? They are having an orgy in front of an idol of Egypt. And going on in verse 13, they grossly desecrated my Sabbaths. In addition to their idolatrous orgy during Moses' absence, they must have also ignored the need to keep the weekly Sabbaths holy, as they had been instructed to do just 3 weeks before the covenant was made and ratified at Sinai. Remember, it was on the 4th Sabbath after they had left Egypt. It was the 4th Sabbath that the manna didn't come. On that day. It had come all the week before, but it didn't come on the 4th. God showed them by the miracle of the manna on that 7th day. This is the Sabbath. This is the only day of the week that's holy. Okay? So God showed them that. Then 3 weeks later, they're at Sinai. So it had been 3 weeks at the time that the covenant was made that they'd been keeping the Sabbath. And even then, the conduct of not keeping the Sabbath in Moses' absence, that could be expected. Because immediately, go back to Exodus chapter 16 where God gave them the manna and showed them by the manna when the Sabbath was to fall. He revealed the weekly Sabbath, declared very forcefully, manna will not come on the Sabbath, so don't go out there to get it. But some of them, maybe many of them, paid no attention to that, and they went on out with the intention of gathering manna. And God says, how long before you're going to obey me? How long before you do? Because you didn't do it in Egypt, you haven't done it since. Verse 13 goes on, then, at that point, I thought to pour out my fury upon them in the wilderness and to make an end of them. It was just before Moses returned from God back to the camp of Israel. Just before that God told Moses of his intention to destroy Israel for their idolatry and failure to keep the terms of the covenant. And keeping the Sabbath holy was point number 4 of that covenant. Exodus chapter 32. Notice what God said. Exodus 32 and verse 9. And the Lord said to Moses, I have seen this people. Now, from where God was, of course, God can see all. God saw exactly what was going on down there at the base of Mount Sinai. Moses, however, was incapable of seeing that. Too far up, and you know how you climb a mountain, what's down at the base, you can't really see that. So Moses could not see what was taking place down below. God saw it. So God says, I've seen this people, and indeed it is a stiff-necked people. Now therefore, let me alone, Moses, that my wrath may burn hot against them, and I may consume them. And once I incinerated them, destroyed them like Sodom and Gomorrah, then I will make of you a great nation. I can still fulfill my promise to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob through you and your descendants. But just stand back. Let me get rid of these people. Verse 14. Ezekiel 20, verse 14. But for the sake of my name, just like in Egypt when he poured out his fury. But for the sake of my name, I did what would keep it from being profaned in the eyes of the nations, in whose sight I had brought them out. That was ultimately the reason God didn't do it. But remember, Moses, when God said, I'm going to wipe them out, Moses pleaded with God. Let's go back to Exodus 32 again. Moses pleaded with God to spare the people due to how he would be perceived by the Egyptians. You know, you brought them out, and then you couldn't do what you said you were going to do to them, so you killed them all. You know, this is basically what Moses said. Well, let's notice here, verse 11, Exodus 32. Then Moses pleaded with the Lord his God. He said, Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you have brought out of the land of Egypt? with great power and with a mighty hand. Why should the Egyptians speak and say, He brought them out to harm them, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce wrath. Relent from this harm to your people. Remember Abraham, Isaac, and Israel, your servants, to whom you swore by your own self, and said to them, I will multiply your descendants as the stars of heaven, and all this land that I have spoken of, I give to your descendants, and they shall inherit it forever. So, verse 14, the Lord relented from the harm which He said He would do to His people. God says for His name's sake. Now, my contention is, based upon what happened when Moses got to the base of Mount Sinai, if Moses had been able to see what was going on, Israel would all come through Moses' line. You remember, Moses was so upset when he saw what Aaron had done and all of the orgy taking place, he slung the commandments and they broke all to pieces. Then he ground up the idol and made them, forced them to drink the water with the gold in it. I don't think Israel would have survived had Moses seen what God was seeing because of Moses' temper, number one. So God didn't let him go all the way down because He could have said, Moses, let me wipe him. No. Moses would say, yeah, let them have it, because, boy, if I could, I'd do it. I can't believe how far they've gone astray. My brother, look at what he's done. He made the idol. Anyway, all right, let's go back to chapter 20. Ezekiel, verse 15. New King James has, So I lifted my hand in an oath to them in the wilderness, that I would not bring them into the land which I had given them, flowing with milk and honey, the glory of all lands, because they despised my judgments and did not walk in my statutes, but profaned my Sabbaths, for their heart went after their idols. In summarizing His relationship with the Israelites in the wilderness, God focused primarily on the rebellions that almost led to their annihilation. Those are the primary ones here in Ezekiel chapter 20. The first, of course, was at Sinai, shortly after the covenant was made. The second was at the time that God told them to enter the promised land. Go up and take the land. That's the next time. Once the faithless scouts, the 10 faithless scouts, gave their evil report of what they perceived to be the obstacles to taking possession of the land of promise, the people believed the faithless scouts. They refused to move forward and take possession of the land that God had promised to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and to them in Egypt. He had promised it to them. God stated that their refusal amounted to their rejection of Him. When you refuse to do what I tell you, you have rejected me. That's what God states. Notice here in Numbers chapter 14. Numbers 14 and verse 11. And the Lord said to Moses, How long will these people reject me? And how long will they not believe me with all the signs which I have performed among them? I will strike them with the pestilence and disinherit them, and I will make of you a nation greater and mightier than they. God was going to strike them with a disease so they would all die except for Moses. The refusal of the Israelites to move forward and take the land was the last of many acts of despite shown to God. That was the last that God was willing to tolerate. Because notice here down in verse 22, Numbers 14:22, because all these men who have seen my glory and the signs which I did in Egypt and in the wilderness, and have put me to the test now these 10 times. Now, the word in the Hebrew means many. These many times they have put me to the test, and have not heeded my voice. They, those individuals, certainly shall not see the land of which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who rejected me see it. Hold your place in Numbers. Let's note verse 17 of Ezekiel 20. Tanakh has, verse 17, but God says, I had pity on them. I was going to send out the pestilence and destroy them, but I had pity on them and did not destroy them. I did not make an end of them in the wilderness. Rather than destroying them by pestilence as He originally had purposed, God showed mercy to the Israelites in accordance with Moses' intercession. Because once again, Moses interceded for the people. Note that here in Numbers 14 and verse 15. Numbers 14:15. Moses speaking to God says, now if you kill these people as one man, then the nations which have heard your fame will speak, saying, because the Lord was not able to bring this people to the land which He swore to give them, therefore He killed them in the wilderness. Now, skipping down to verse 20, then the Lord said, I have pardoned according to your word. And so Moses interceded, and God says, okay, Moses, I will pardon them based upon what you say. Now, there was still a penalty for their rebellion against God and the instructions that God had given them to go up and take the land. All of the Israelites who were 20 years of age and older, with the exceptions, of course, of Caleb and Joshua, who were the two faithful scouts, came back and said, we can do it. God is with us. Nothing can stop us. The God who worked all of these miracles in Egypt, opened the Red Sea. What is there in this land that can possibly hold us back with God on our side? That was Caleb and Joshua. So they were exceptions. But all the rest were denied entry into the Promised Land. And they would die in the wilderness over the course of the 40 years of time that they were there. And again, that 40 years started when Israel crossed the Red Sea and entered into Midian. That was the time the 40 years started. They'd already been over a year in the wilderness at the time that God had them go up to take the land. Back in chapter 20, verse 18, Ezekiel 20:18, but I said to their children in the wilderness, do not walk in the statutes, or the Tanakh has here, do not follow the practices of your fathers, nor observe their judgments, nor defile yourselves with their idols. As the older generation, or maybe the older generations, a couple of them, of the Israelites died off, the next generation of their children, who were also denied entry into the Promised Land, continued to follow the same practices of their parents, which were the customs and idolatry that they themselves had learned living in Egypt. Because if they were 20 years and older, they were adults in Egypt. And they were doing the same things. But, the ones who were maybe in their 70s or 80s, they died off, then the 60s and then the 50s. And so as this 40 years elapses, these people are dying off. And here at the younger generation, well, you've already denied us, so what profit is it of us to do these things if we can't enter the Promised Land? Maybe that was their attitude. God doesn't say. But God spoke to them and says, I said to their children, don't do these things. Don't follow the course of your parents that have already died and your grandparents that have already died here in the wilderness. Going on in verse 19, I am the Lord your God. Walk in my statutes, keep my judgments and do them. Hallow my Sabbaths, or keep my Sabbaths holy, the Revised English Bible has. And they, my Sabbaths, will be a sign between me and you, that you may know that I am the Lord your God. This younger adult generation of Israelites, again, probably in their 20s, 30s, maybe even early 40s, like their parents, had been heavily exposed to the customs and idolatry within the land of Egypt. After cautioning them to forsake everything that pertained to Egypt, God insisted that they do what was required by the covenant to which they had agreed at Mount Sinai. You were part of that group that said, whatever the Lord has said, we will do. You were adults then. You promised. You made an oath. You vowed a vow. So you do it. Their need to keep the Sabbath holy was not only required by the fourth commandment. Again, it was also a sign, a weekly reminder of their special relationship with God. Exodus chapter 31, God goes through and explains here the importance of the Sabbath to His people. Exodus 31 and verse 13. Here God tells Moses, "Speak also to the children of Israel, saying, Surely my Sabbaths you shall keep, for it is a sign between me and you throughout your generations, that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you." That seventh day is going to always identify you as being those who are in a covenant with God. Now, others, besides Jews, have adopted the seventh day. Some legitimately as the church of God, and then others because, well, they tried to emulate certain things in the Bible. He goes on that you may know that I am the Lord who sanctifies you. You, verse 14, shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the seventh is the Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. Now, it's a sign between Israel and God, but it's still something that God has required and will require of every human being that will ever be in His kingdom. All will ultimately, whether now or in the resurrection, be required to keep the seventh day holy. Chapter 20, verse 21. Notwithstanding, despite telling them to do this, notwithstanding, the children rebelled against me. They did not walk in my statutes, and were not careful to observe my judgments, which, if a man does, he shall live by them. This is about the third or fourth time that God keeps saying, you do it, you're going to live. But they profaned my Sabbaths. Then I said, I would pour out my fury on them and fulfill my anger against them in the wilderness. Regardless of all the admonitions God gave them, they continued to reject Him and engage in conduct expressly forbidden in the terms of the covenant that they had made with and agreed to with Him. This verse refers to an event that occurred toward the close of the 40 years that Israel was confined in the wilderness. Notice here in Numbers chapter 25. Numbers 25 and in verse 1. So, breaking into verse 1, latter half, the people of Israel, the Israelites, began to commit harlotry with the women of Moab. They invited the people to the sacrifice of their gods, and the people ate and bowed down to their gods. So Israel was joined to Baal of Peor, and the anger of the Lord was aroused against Israel. Now, this is toward the end. This is toward the close of the 40 years. And they're engaging in this. Chapter 20. God said, I'll pour out my fury and fulfill my anger against them in the wilderness. But, verse 22, Tanakh, I held back my hand and acted for the sake of my name. It was always for the sake of His name, because of the way He would be perceived. That it might not be profane in the sight of the nations before whose eyes I had led them out. God sent a deadly plague on the people, and then He instructed Moses that the only way that that plague could be stopped was to hang every individual of Israel who was involved in this abominable conduct at Baal Peor. The zeal, of course, of Phinehas in carrying out God's instruction brought an end to the plague, which ultimately killed 24,000 Israelites. It wasn't just a few people involved in this. 24,000! And this is after almost 40 years. This was the mentality of the people. They were taken out of Egypt, but Egypt was still firmly in them. Verse 23, going on in the New King James. Also, I lifted my hand in an oath to those in the wilderness, that I would scatter them among the Gentiles, or among the nations, and disperse them throughout the countries, because they had not executed my judgments, but had despised my statutes, profaned my Sabbaths, and their eyes were fixed on their fathers' idols. Again, this is 38, 39 years into it. In his last address before he died, Moses, back here in Deuteronomy chapter 4, remember the whole book of Deuteronomy, other than the last few verses, is the account of what Moses spoke to Israel before he died. A month later, Joshua led them into the Promised Land, led them through the Jordan River into the Promised Land. So this was at that point in time, 30 days before entrance into the Promised Land. Moses relayed God's oath that he mentions here. Verse 26, Deuteronomy 4. God said, I call heaven and earth to witness against you this day. That is all of Israel. That you, this entire nation, will soon utterly perish from the land which you cross over the Jordan to possess. You will not prolong your days in it, but will be utterly destroyed, and the Lord will scatter you among the peoples. Moses, at the very beginning almost of this address, tells them, you're going over to get it, but you're not going to have it very long. Chapter 20, verse 25, therefore, I also gave them up to statutes that were not good, and judgments by which they could not live. Or the New Living Translation has, I gave them over to worthless decrees and regulations that would not lead to life. Now, these statutes and judgments that he mentions here in verse 25 could not be referencing the statutes and judgments of God. Because, hold your place there, in Psalm 19, verse 8, Psalm 19, verse 8, the statutes of the Lord are right. Okay? Ezekiel 20:25 says, I gave them up to statutes that were not good. But God's statutes, it says here, are right, rejoicing the heart. The commandment of the Lord is pure, enlightening the eyes. The fear of the Lord is clean, enduring forever. The judgments of the Lord are true and righteous altogether. So, what we read back here in chapter 20 of Ezekiel, verse 25, cannot be referenced to God's statutes and God's judgments. Since Israel forsook God, God forsook them, leaving them to devise through their own reasoning statutes and judgments which would lead them ultimately to destruction. Because they rejected God's instructions, which He has said many times, back up here in verse 11, which if a man does, he shall live by them. Because they rejected those instructions that would give them life, they would become subject to the dictates, practices, and traditions of men, which would lead to the opposite of life. It would lead to death. The results of pursuing the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Verse 26, and I pronounced them unclean because of their ritual gifts or their sacrifices, in that they caused all their firstborn to pass through the fire, that I might make them desolate, and that they might know that I am the Lord. When the Israelites rejected God's instructions, they turned away from God's prohibition of sacrificing their children to idols. You know, back in Leviticus chapter 18, God was very specific. You don't have your children pass through the fire to Molech or any other idol. But they were doing that. They began practicing statutes that were not good. Not God's statutes, but other statutes. The statutes involved in idol worship. They polluted. They made unclean the firstborn. That's what God says. They caused all their firstborn to pass through the fire, that I might make them desolate, and that they might know that I am the Lord. Remember, the firstborn, God, back at the time of the Exodus, in Exodus chapter 13, I think about verse 12, 15. Anyway, God told them then that you set apart, you devote to me every firstborn. Every firstborn was to be devoted to God, and lo and behold, they're devoting the firstborn that were God's to these idols. So God was very upset. Verse 27, therefore, Son of man, speak to the house of Israel and say to them, thus says the Lord God, in this too your fathers or your ancestors have blasphemed me by being unfaithful to me. For when I brought them into the land for which I had lifted my hand in an oath to give them, and they saw all the high hills and all the thick trees, there they offered their sacrifices and provoked me with their offerings. There they also sent up their sweet aroma and poured out their drink offerings. Once Israel entered into the promised land, it didn't take long for them to adopt the idolatries and religious practices of the people who were not driven out of the land as God had commanded and ordered them to do. Just get them out of the land. They shouldn't be here. And don't adopt their religious practices. Notice in Judges chapter 2. Judges 2 and verse 7. So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord. Now skipping down to verse 10. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord. Verse 11, then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served Baals. And they forsook the Lord God of their fathers, who had brought them out of the land of Egypt. And they followed other gods from among the gods of the people who were all around them, and they bowed down to them, and they provoked the Lord to anger. That's what happened during the course of the period of the Judges. Then I said to them, what is this high place to which you go? What is this high place to which you go? Even though God had warned them to destroy the high places and everything associated with pagan worship when they entered the Promised Land. Again, you go back to Deuteronomy chapter 12, and most of that chapter is dealing with, you go in, you burn their Asherah poles, you destroy their groves, destroy them, have nothing to do with them. Do not try to emulate that. That's what they were commanded to do. And even though they were warned, they failed to do it. They failed. God then called them to account, asking them here how it was that they believed they could ignore His instructions and go up to the high places that were used to worship idols. How can you do this? God asked. So, verse 29 goes on, its name is called Bama to this day. Its name is called Bama. Bama is a compound of two Hebrew words. Ba, which means go, and ma, which means what. Hence, what is this high place to which you go? Okay, he's using that. He has made this word. It was a name that reflected God's displeasure with the idolatrous worship the Israelites began committing during the time of the judges. Bama. That was basically, what do you think you're doing? What do you think you're doing? The problem was that the infamous term Bama was still applicable in Ezekiel's day because of what the Jews in Ezekiel's time were still doing, even at God's temple in Jerusalem. To God, that was Bama, what was going on. You know, back in chapter 8, we went through the 70 elders that were in the chambers of the temple, worshiping their idols. We saw the 25 priests standing out in front of the temple to the east, worshiping the sun that's rising. We saw the women weeping for Tammuz in the women's court there by the temple. All of that is Bama. All of that was what was done at the high places. It was still being done in Ezekiel's time. And these elders had the audacity to come and inquire of God, well, is there some way that this can be averted? No, because the problem is with the mind of these people. It's the same as it's always been. There's been no change. Chapter 20, verse 30, New International. Therefore say to the house of Israel, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Will you defile yourselves the way your fathers did and lust? Other translations have go astray, play the harlot after their vile images or their idols. When you offer your gifts, the sacrifice of your sons in the fire, you continue to defile yourselves with all your idols to this day. Am I to let you inquire of me, O house of Israel? You don't even deserve to draw breath, much less ask me a question. As surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will not let you inquire of me. Or Tanakh says, I will not respond to you. God has given an overview of the sordid history of the children of Israel. From the time He revealed Himself to them in the land of Egypt until the time then current in Ezekiel's day. They had turned away from God, polluted the sign that was to remind them of their unique relationship with God, and had indulged in idolatry. So, He now asks the elders who had come to Ezekiel, how is it that they could even think of asking Him questions, much less expect a response from Him, when their own people, who yet remained in the kingdom of Judah, still over in the area of Jerusalem, were still engaged in exactly the same sins as all of the past generations of Israelites that were warned before they entered by Moses in Deuteronomy 4, you're not going to be there very long. You're going to be kicked out of that land. How is it possible? Because there's been no change. These people still have stones for hearts. Verse 32, New International continues, you say, we want to be like the nations, like the peoples of the world who serve or who worship, other translations have, wood and stone. That's what we want to be like. We want to be like the world. But what you have in mind will never happen. I'm not going to let you be like the world per se. God rejected the desire of those of the southern kingdom of Judah to cast God aside completely and be like other nations that were steeped in idolatrous worship. So it can't be. He could not and would not allow them to discard him. It was absolutely necessary for them to continue to recognize their special relationship with him, whether they wanted to or not. They had to. Now, he's talking to the southern kingdom. He's talking to the Jews here, not the northern kingdom. When it says here, to the house of Israel, that's this part of the house of Israel. You Jews, you can't do that. You can't do what the northern kingdom did. The Messiah was to be born into the tribe of Judah, and it was imperative that the God of Israel was the only deity being worshipped by the Jews during the time that he was in the flesh. He could not grow up as a child in an environment of idolatry. You can't. You cannot. One reason why it's the Jewish Sabbath today is because God has made certain that they, despite the fact they still disobey him, people know who they are. They know who they are. Verse 33, New International goes on, as surely as I live, declares the sovereign Lord, I will rule over you with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm and with outpoured wrath or overflowing fury, the Tanakh has. This passage, verse 33, begins a section that is not only historical of how God intervened in the lives of the descendants of Jacob in Ezekiel's day, but also reflects how God would, despite their resistance, continue to intervene for these people through the remainder of the age. The fury that he mentions here, that he poured out on them in Ezekiel's day, was accomplished by using Babylon. There's fury that's going to be poured out on them again, because Isaiah chapter 10 talks about a hypocritical nation being punished by the beast and the overthrow, once again, of Jerusalem. So, that's where we will close today. The next section properly belongs with the next chapter anyway.